The stench of burning oil and decaying flesh lingered in the air, an invisible cloud that clung to the barren landscape like a curse. Sergeant Daniel Ross stood on the edge of a hill, looking down at the remnants of a once thriving village. Now only rubble and ash remained, the ghosts of its former inhabitants haunting the shattered streets below. Daniel tightened his grip on the rifle slung over his shoulder, though the weight of it felt heavier with each passing day. He had been a soldier for nearly a decade, long enough to see the ugliness of war in all its forms. The bloodstains on his hands, once washed away by duty and orders, now felt permanent, etched into his skin like a brand. Each step he took across the barren earth was a step further into darkness he feared he could never escape.
"Sergeant Ross,"
called out Corporal Jenkins, snapping Daniel out of his reverie. Jenkins, a young man barely out of his teens, stood stiffly at attention, the eager gleam in his eyes a stark contrast to Daniel's weary gaze.
"Captain needs you in the command tent. We're about to get briefed."
Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening as he turned away from the bleak vista.
"I'll be right there,"
he replied, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. The command tent, like everything else in the godforsaken place, was a temporary structure, its canvas walls flapping weakly in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the kind that precedes a mission that everyone knows could go wrong in 100 different ways. Captain Martin stood at the center of the tent, a tall, imposing figure with a reputation of being as unyielding as steel. He was surrounded by a map spread out on a table, its surface marked with red circles and lines that indicated their targets. As Daniel entered, Martin's cold blue eyes flicked up to meet his.
"Ross,"
Martin began, his voice as sharp as a knife.
"we've got intel on a high-value target, holed up in the eastern sector. We're going in tonight to take him out. This is a surgical strike. Quick, clean, no collateral damage."
Daniel nodded again, the motion automatic. He barely registered the rest of the briefing, his mind wandering back to the countless missions before this one, each one a variation of the same brutal theme. They were always told it was for the greater good, that the lives they took were necessary sacrifices on the altar of peace. But Daniel had started to question that narrative, the cracks in the facade widening with each pull of the trigger. After the briefing, Daniel and his squad gathered their gear in silence. The men around him moved with mechanical precision, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. Jenkins, with his youthful energy, was an exception, his nervous excitement almost palpable.
"You ready for this, Sergeant?"
Jenkins asked, his voice betraying a mix of fear and anticipation. Daniel forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes.
"As ready as I'll ever be,"
he replied, though deep down he wasn't sure he could do it again, could take another life in the name of a cause he no longer believed in. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in a shroud of darkness as the squad moved out. They advanced in silence, the only sounds the crunch of the gravel underfoot and a distant rumble of artillery in the background. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, a dull, relentless beat that matched the growing sense of dread in his gut. As they approached the enemy's stronghold, Daniel found himself in the rear of the group, his thoughts a swirling storm of doubt and fear. He was a soldier trained to follow orders, to execute his missions without question. But as they drew closer to their target, he felt a growing unease, a voice in the back of his mind whispering that something was terribly wrong. His hand tightened around the grip of his rifle, the cold metal a familiar comfort, but tonight it felt like a burden, one that he wasn't sure he could carry any longer. Daniel Ross had never been a violent man, even as a child. He had shielded away from fights, preferring to solve conflicts with words rather than fists. But war didn't care about your nature. It molded you into what it needed, a weapon, a tool of destruction. He remembered his first kill as if it happened yesterday. It was years ago in a different war, in a different part of the world, but the memory was as fresh as the blood that had stained his hands. The patrol had been routine, an assignment to secure a small village that had been rumored to harbor insurgents. Daniel had been a young recruit then, full of the naive belief that he was fighting for something noble. They moved through the village cautiously, their weapons drawn, eyes scanning every shadow. Daniel had been in the rear, his heart pounding with the adrenaline of his first real mission. He was scared but determined, eager to prove himself. They turned a corner, and there he was, a young man barely older than Daniel, standing in the middle of the street, a rifle clutched in his hands. Everything happened in a blur. The young man raised his weapon, and instinct took over. Daniel pulled the trigger before he even had time to think. The sound of the gunshot echoed in the narrow street, followed by the dull thud of a body hitting the ground. For a moment, the world went silent. Daniel stood there, his rifle raised, staring at the body of the man he had just killed. The man's eyes were wide open, his face frozen in an expression of shock. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and thick, seeping into the dirt. Daniel's hands trembled as he lowered his weapon. His squad leader, a grizzled veteran with a cold, steely gaze, clapped him on the shoulder.
Good job, Ross.
He had said.
That's one less enemy to worry about.
Daniel didn't feel like he had done a good job. He felt sick, the bile rising in his throat as he looked at the lifeless body at his feet. This man had been no different from him, just a young soldier for his cause, doing what he believed was right. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face, his wide, terrified eyes staring up at him. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, crushing his chest until he could barely breathe. From that day forward, Daniel had been a changed man. The idealism that had driven him to join the army in the first place was gone, replaced by a cold, hard realism. War wasn't about heroism of glory, it was about survival, and survival meant doing things that haunted you for the rest of your life. Back in the present, Daniel woke with a start, his heart racing, his body drenched in sweat. The memory of his first kill had come in a dream, as it often did. It was a memory he could never escape, no matter how many years passed or how many battles he fought. He sat up in his bunk, running a hand through his damp hair. Outside, the camp was quiet and the other soldiers asleep or standing watch. But Daniel knew there was no more sleep for him tonight. As he sat there in the darkness, the weight of his past pressed down on him, a heavy burden that he carried alone. He'd killed many men since the first one, each one adding another layer of guilt and regret to his soul. He'd become what the army needed him to be, a weapon, a tool for destruction. But he wasn't sure he could do it anymore, not after everything he had seen, everything he had done. Daniel lay back down, staring up at the ceiling in his tent, his mind racing. The mission they were about to undertake would be another bloody chapter in the endless cycle of violence. But for the first time, Daniel wasn't sure he could go through with it. The thought of taking another life, of adding another ghost to his already crowded mind, filled him with a deep, overwhelming dread. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he lay there, listening to the sounds of the night, haunted by the memory of a man he had killed so many years ago. The darkness enveloped them as they moved through the twisted remnants of what had been once a road. The moon, a crescent in the sky, provided barely enough light to see by, casting eerie shadows across the desolate landscape. Daniel Ross led his squad, each step measured and silent, the weight of his rifle pressing against his shoulder like a silent reminder of the task at hand. The mission was straightforward, at least on paper. Infiltrate the enemy's stronghold, eliminate the high-value target, and extract before dawn. But Daniel had been in the military long enough to know that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that made your skin prickle and your senses heighten. Every rustle of the wind, every distant sound could be a threat or nothing at all. Jenkins moved up beside him, his breath visible in the cold night air. The young soldier's usual nervous energy was subdued, replaced by a focused intensity.
We're close now, Sergeant.
Jenkins whispered, his voice barely audible. Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He could see the faint outline of the enemy stronghold ahead, a dark mass against the lighter sky. It wasn't much, just a fortified building surrounded by makeshift barricades, but it was enough to make their approach dangerous. They moved forward, inching closer to their objective. The silence was oppressive, broken only by occasional snap of a twig or the distant boom of artillery. The war was all around them, a constant backdrop to their lives, but in these moments it felt as though the world had narrowed to just a small patch on the ground, this single mission. As they approached the perimeter, Daniel held up a hand, signaling to the squad to halt. They crouched low, blending into the shadows, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. The stronghold loomed ahead, dark and silent, but Daniel knew better than to trust appearances. The enemy was out there, somewhere, waiting. He motioned for Jenkins to take point, and the younger soldier moved forward, his rifle at the ready. The rest of the squad followed, spreading out to cover all angles. Daniel stayed at the rear, his heart pounding in his chest, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of what he was about to do. His mind raced as they closed in on the building. He could picture the people inside, men, maybe women too, soldiers like him, following their orders, believing they were doing the right thing. He could almost see their faces, reflections of his own, distorted by the lens of war. What right did he have to take their lives? What difference did it make if they wore a different uniform or spoke a different language? As they reached the outer wall, Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement to his left. He turned sharply, his finger hovering over the trigger, only to realize it was nothing. A trick of the shadows. He let out a slow breath, trying to steady his nerves, but there was no time for hesitation. They found a gap in the wall just big enough for them to squeeze through, one at a time. Jenkins went first, followed by the others, until it was Daniel's turn. As he slipped through the opening, the rough stone scraping against his gear, he felt the pang of unease. His instincts, honed by years of combat, told him something was wrong. They regrouped inside the compound, crouching low behind a stack of crates. Ahead, the entrance to the building was guarded by 2 soldiers, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. Daniel signaled for Jenkins to take them out quietly, and the young soldier nodded, moving into position. Jenkins was good at this. Too good, Daniel thought as he watched him silently approach the guards. In a matter of moments, it was over. The guards crumpled to the ground, their life snuffed out without a sound. Daniel's stomach churned as he watched, a familiar nausea rising within him. How many more lives would they have to take tonight? How many more souls would they have to carry? With the guards neutralized, they moved toward the entrance. The door creaked open and Daniel led the way inside, his rifle sweeping the room for threats. The interior was as dark and foreboding as the outside, the air thick with the smell of damp and decay. They moved through the narrow corridors, the only sound, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Daniel's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. The soldier in him wanted to focus on the mission, to push aside the doubts and do what needed to be done. But the man in him, the part that had seen too much, that had lost too much, was screaming at him to stop, to turn back, to abandon his madness before it consumed him entirely. They reached a set of stairs leading down into what appeared to be a basement. This was it. The target was somewhere below. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his rifle tighter, forcing him to focus. This was just another mission, he told himself, just another target, but the words rang hollow in his mind. As they descended the stairs, the air grew colder, the walls closing in around them. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat, loud and insistent, a reminder that he was still alive and still human. But for how much longer? How many more times could he do this before he lost that humanity completely? At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a dimly lit hallway, the sound of voices drifting from behind a door at the far end. Daniel motioned for his squad to take positions on either side of the door. This was it, the final moment before everything changed, one way or another. His hand hovered over the door handle, his mind racing. He knew what he was supposed to do, he knew the orders, but something inside him was rebelling, a deep, visceral resistance to the violence that was about to unfold. Daniel took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess of fear, doubt, and growing sense of resolve. This mission, this war, it wasn't what he had signed up for. It wasn't what he believed in anymore, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to do something about it. With one final glance at his squad, Daniel made his decision. Daniel's pulse quickened as he gripped the door handle, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers. He could hear the muffled voices on the other side, speaking in a language he didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, anxious, perhaps fearful. He swallowed hard, trying to suppress the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. This was the moment he had been trained for, the moment where all his skills as a soldier would be put to the test, but this time something was different. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking as the squad moved into the room with military precision, their weapons raised, ready to strike. The scene that greeted them was not what Daniel had expected. Instead of a hardened combatants, he found himself staring at a small group of men, unarmed and huddled around a table littered with papers and maps. They looked up in shock as the soldiers burst in, their expressions a mix of terror and confusion. For a brief moment, the room was frozen in time, both sides locked in a tense standoff. Daniel's eyes scanned the faces before him, landing on one in particular, a young man no older than Jenkins, standing at the back of the room. His hands were raised in a gesture of surrender, his eyes wide with fear. It was a look Daniel knew all too well, one he had seen reflected in his own face years ago when he had stood over the body of his first kill. The young man's gaze met Daniel's, and in that instant something shifted inside him. The rifle in his hand suddenly felt like a dead weight, an instrument of death that he could no longer wield. He could see the young man's chest rising and falling rapidly, his breath shallow and panicked. This wasn't an enemy, Daniel realized. This was just another human being, caught up in the same nightmare that had ensnared them all.
Sergeant!
Jenkins' voice cut through the silence, his tone questioning, unsure. Daniel could feel the eyes of the squad on him, waiting for his order to fire. The tension in the room was palpable, a ticking bomb ready to explode with the slightest provocation. But Daniel couldn't do it. He couldn't bring himself to give that order that would end this young man's life, that would add yet another ghost to the growing chorus that haunted his dreams. He hesitated, his mind racing through the possible outcomes of this split-second decision. The rules of war, the orders had been given. All screamed at him to pull the trigger, to finish the mission, but a deeper, quieter voice, the voice of his conscience, pleaded with him to choose a different path. The young man's lips trembled as he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper.
Please, don't.
It was a simple plea, one that Daniel had heard countless times before, but never in a moment like this, when he was already teetering on the edge. Daniel took a step back, lowering his weapon. His squad exchanged confused glances, clearly unsure of what was happening. This wasn't how the mission was supposed to go. There was supposed to be a clear enemy, a clear objective, but now the lines had blurred beyond recognition.
Get out of here.
Daniel said quietly, his voice firm despite the turmoil raging inside him. The young man stared at him, uncomprehending, and Daniel had to repeat himself.
Go. Now.
The young man didn't need to be told a third time. He bolted for the door, the others following close behind, leaving the room empty except for Daniel and his squad. Jenkins looked at him, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief.
Sergeant, what the hell?
Stand down, Jenkins.
Daniel interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument.
This mission is over. We're leaving.
But the target!
There's no target here.
Daniel snapped, more harshly than he intended. He could see the confusion and frustration on Jenkins' face, but there was no time to explain. They had to move, and quickly, before anyone realized what had happened.
Fall back!
Daniel ordered, already heading towards the exit. The squad hesitated for a moment, then followed, their movements uncertain, as if they were sleepwalking through a nightmare. They retraced their steps through the darkened hallways, their retreat as silent as their approach had been. Daniel's mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of relief, fear, and a gnawing uncertainty about what he had just done. He had disobeyed orders, compromised the mission, and spared the life of an enemy combatant. But as they emerged into the cool night air, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying had suddenly been lifted. The squad regrouped outside the stronghold, the tension still thick in the air. Jenkins looked at Daniel, his expression a mixture of anger and confusion.
Sergeant, what's going on? We had them. Why didn't we?
I made a decision.
Daniel said, cutting him off.
It's over.
But...
Enough, Jenkins.
Daniel said, his voice quiet but firm.
We're done here.
Jenkins clenched his jaw, clearly struggling with the turn of events, but he nodded, falling in line as they made their way back to the extraction point. As they moved through the darkness, Daniel felt the weight of what he had done begin to settle on his shoulders. He knew there would be consequences for his actions, but this decision to spare those lives would not be taken lightly by his superiors. But for the first time in a long while, he felt that he had done something right, something that was true to the man he wanted to be, not the soldier he had been molded into. The squad reached the extraction point just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. They climbed into the waiting transport, the mood heavy and silent. Daniel took a seat at the back, staring out the war-torn landscape as it faded into the distance. He had made his choice, now he would have to live with it. The transport rumbled to a halt outside the base perimeter, its engine sputtering as the dust settled around them. The silence within the vehicle was thick with unspoken words, the tension almost suffocating. Daniel Ross was the first to step out, his boots hitting the ground with a sense of finality that sent a shiver up his spine. He could feel the eyes of his squad on him, a mixture of confusion, frustration, and silent accusation in their stares. Daniel knew what they were thinking. Hell, he didn't even have all the answers himself. What he had done, what he had chose not to do, was a breach of everything he had been trained to believe in. But the doubt that was taking root in his heart was now too deep, too entwined with who he was becoming. He walked briskly toward the command tent, bracing himself for the inevitable confrontation. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the base, but the warmth of the day did little to soothe the cold dread building in his chest. He could already feel the judgment in the air, the whispers of disapproval from the other soldiers as he passed by. The command tent loomed ahead, a stark reminder of the rigid hierarchy he was about to challenge. As he approached, the flap of the tent swung open, and Captain Martin stepped out, his expression as hard as granite. His sharp eyes locked onto Daniel, and for a moment neither man spoke.
Ross!
Martin barked, his voice laced with controlled fury.
Inside now!
Daniel followed him into the tent, his heart pounding in his ears. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the soft glow of a lamp on the table. The map from the previous night's briefing still lay there, the red circles and lines mocking him with their clarity of purpose. Martin wasted no time getting to the point.
What the hell happened out there?
Martin demanded, his voice low and dangerous. He wasn't the type to shout, but his words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Daniel straightened, meeting Martin's gaze without flinching.
The intel was wrong,
he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside.
There was no high-value target in that stronghold. Just a group of unarmed men. Civilians as far as I could tell.
Civilians?
Martin's eyes narrowed, his fist clenched at his sides.
And you let them go, just like that?
They weren't a threat,
Daniel replied, forcing himself to keep his tone calm.
There was no reason to engage.
No reason to.
Martin cut himself off, taking a deep breath as if trying to contain his rage.
Ross, do you have any idea what you've done? You had a direct order to eliminate any potential threats. You disobeyed that order, compromised the mission, and jeopardized the safety of your entire squad.
Daniel knew this was coming, but the words still hit him like a blow to the chest. He had been prepared for it, but the reality was harsher than he had imagined.
With all due respect, Captain,
He said, choosing his words carefully.
I made a judgment call based on the situation. Those men posed no immediate danger to us. Killing them would have been senseless.
Judgment call?
Martin's voice was cold, the anger simmering just beneath the surface.
It's not your place to make judgment calls, Sergeant. Your job is to follow orders, nothing more. You're a soldier, not a philosopher.
Daniel stood his ground, though the weight of Martin's words bore down on him.
Maybe that's the problem, sir.
He said quietly.
Maybe following orders isn't always the right thing to do.
For a moment, the tent was filled with nothing but the sound of their breathing, the tension so thick it felt like the air was being sucked from the room. Martin's expression hardened further, if that was possible, and he took a step closer to Daniel, his eyes, gaze burning with intensity.
You're walking a very fine line, Ross,
Martin said, his voice barely above a whisper.
I could have you court-martialed for this. Do you understand that?
Daniel swallowed hard, his mouth dry.
I understand, sir.
Martin studied him for a long moment as if searching for something, some sign of weakness, of doubt, but Daniel had none to offer. He had made his choice, and he would stand by it, no matter the cost. Finally, Martin shook his head, a mixture of disappointment and anger in his eyes.
You're off this mission, Ross. Effective immediately. I'll decide what to do with you later.
Daniel nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him.
Understood, sir.
Without a word, Martin turned away, signaling that the conversation was over. Daniel took the hint and left the tent, stepping back into the harsh light of the day. The base was alive with activity, soldiers going about their duties as if nothing changed, as if the world was still the same. But for Daniel, everything had changed. He walked away from the command tent, his mind heavy with the implications of what had just transpired. He'd crossed the line, one that could never be uncrossed. His future in the army was uncertain at best, but there was no turning back now. As he made his way back to his quarters, Daniel felt a deep weariness settle over him, a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical. He had been a soldier for so long that he had almost forgotten what it meant to be anything else. But now, as the weight of his decision pressed down on him, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a different path ahead. A path that didn't involve killing, a path that led away from the horrors of war towards something, anything, better. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a life beyond the battlefield. It was a distant, uncertain future, one that scared him almost as much as the thought of staying. But it was a future he knew he had to pursue, no matter what the cost. The days that followed were a blur of monotony, each one bleeding into the next as Daniel Ross grappled with the fallout of his actions. Confined to base, he was stripped of his command duties, left to wrestle with the consequences of his defiance in the isolation of his quarters. The other soldiers kept their distance, either out of respect or suspicion, and Daniel found himself adrift in a sea of uncertainty. He spent time thinking about the war, about his life, about the choices that had brought him to this point. The more he thought, the more he realized that he could no longer reconcile the man he wanted to be with the soldier he was expected to remain. But walking away from the military was not a decision he could make lightly. It would mean leaving behind everything he had ever known, venturing into a world that was foreign to him, where his skills might no longer have value. It was during one of these long, sleepless nights that Captain Martin came to see him. The knock on his door was sharp, authoritative, and when Daniel opened it, he found Martin standing there, his expression unreadable.
Captain!
Daniel greeted him, stepping inside to let him in. The room was sparse, barely more than a cot and a footlocker, but Martin didn't seem interested in the surroundings. He turned to face Daniel, his eyes searching for something in the younger man's face.
Ross!
Martin began, his tone unusually measured, almost contemplative.
I've given some thought to what happened on that mission, to your actions.
Daniel remained silent, bracing himself for whatever judgment was to come. But Martin's next words surprised him.
High Command has decided not to court-martial you,
Martin continued.
but they've made it clear that your future in the Army is precarious.
Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding.
I understand, sir.
Martin nodded as if expecting that response.
However, we're in the middle of a war, and resources are stretched thin. They're not about to throw away a soldier. With your experience, not yet.
Daniel frowned slightly, unsure where this was going.
What are you saying, Captain?
Martin's gaze hardened.
I'm saying that they want to give you one last chance, Ross. A final mission to prove where your loyalties lie. If you succeed, you might have a future here. If not...
He let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine.
What's the mission?
Martin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folder, handing it to Daniel.
It's a high-risk operation, one that could turn the tide in this sector. Intelligence has identified a key enemy leader, someone who's been coordinating attacks against our forces. Your job is to eliminate him.
Daniel opened the folder, scanning the contents. The target was indeed a significant figure, someone whose removal would deal a serious blow to the enemy's operations. But as Daniel read through the details, the familiar unease returned, gnawing at him from within.
And if I refuse?
Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Martin's expression didn't change.
If you refuse, they'll discharge you. Maybe dishonorably, maybe not. But either way, your career here is over.
The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Daniel closed the folder and set it aside, his mind racing. This was it, the moment he had been dreading, the final test of his convictions. He could follow orders, take the mission, and continue down the path that had been laid out for him, or he could walk away, abandoning everything he had ever known. The choice seemed impossibly difficult, but deep down Daniel knew he had already made his decision. The weight of the rifle, the memories of those he had killed, the young man he had spared, they all pointed to the same conclusion.
I need some time to think, Captain.
Daniel finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. Martin studied him for a long moment, then nodded.
You'll have until tomorrow morning, Ross. After that, I expect your answer.
With that, Martin turned and left the room, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts once more. The folder sat on a small table, a silent remember of the decision he had to make. Daniel stared at it, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. On one hand, he knew what was expected of him, what he had been trained to do. On the other hand, there was a growing realization that he could no longer live this way, that the man he wanted to be was incompatible with the life of a soldier. The night passed slowly, each hour dragging on as Daniel weighed his options. Sleep eluded him, and by the time the first light of dawn crept into the room, he knew what he had to do. When the sun finally rose, Daniel gathered his gear, his movements slow and deliberate. He put on his uniform for what he knew might be the last time, each piece of clothing feeling heavier than usual, laden with the memories and burdens he had accumulated over the years. He made his way to the command tent, his steps measured, his heart steady. The base was quiet in the early morning light, the soldiers going about their routines, unaware of the decision that was about to be made. When Daniel entered the tent, Captain Martin was already there waiting for him. The older man looked up, his expression unreadable as Daniel approached.
Well,
Martin said, his tone neutral, betraying nothing of his own expectations. Daniel took a deep breath, meeting Martin's gaze with unwavering resolve.
I'm not taking the mission, Captain.
For a moment, Martin said nothing, his face giving away nothing. Then he nodded slowly, as if he had expected this outcome all along.
So that's your decision?
It is,
Daniel replied, his voice steady.
I can't do it anymore, sir. I can't keep killing for a cause I don't believe in. I don't want to be part of this war any longer.
Martin regarded him in silence for what felt like an eternity. Then, to Daniel's surprise, a flicker of something, perhaps respect, passed through the captain's eyes.
You know what this means, Ross?
Martin said, his voice softer now.
There's no coming back from this.
I know,
Daniel replied.
but it's the only way I can live with myself.
Martin sighed, a deep, weary sound that spoke of his own struggles, his own conflicts.
I'll process your discharge papers. You'll be out by the end of the week. After that, you're on your own.
Thank you, sir.
Daniel said, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Martin offered a curt nod, then turned away, signaling the end of a conversation. Daniel took one last look around the command tent, the maps, the orders, the structure that had all defined his life for so long. Then he walked out, leaving it all behind. As he stepped into the morning light, Daniel felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He had no idea what his future held, no idea where he would go or what he would do. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was walking towards something, not away from it. And that, he realized, was enough. As Daniel left, the base receded in the distance, its rigid structures, barbed wire fences becoming a faint silhouette against the horizon. Daniel Ross walked away from it all, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his rifle left behind in the armory, a relic of a life he no longer wanted to carry with him. The road ahead was uncertain, a long stretch of possibilities, but each step he took felt lighter, as though the ground beneath him was no longer weighted down by the violence and death he had once known. For the first time in years, Daniel was free, not just free from the military, but free from the chains that had bound his conscience. Free from the role of the soldier that had suffocated the man he wanted to be. The morning air was crisp, filled with the promise of a new beginning. As he walked, he allowed himself to think about the future, a future that until now had seemed too distant, too impossible to grasp. He had no destination in mind, no clear plan for what came next. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. His entire adult life had been dictated by orders, by missions, by the relentless structure of military life. Now the only orders he had to follow were his own, and that was a freedom he was still learning to accept. He thought of the letter he had written to his family, the one he had left behind in his quarters before leaving the base. In it, he had tried to explain his decision to make them understand why he could no longer be the person they expected him to be. It had been the hardest letter he had ever written, every word a struggle to convey the depth of the conviction without alienating those he loved. But in the end, he knew they would either accept his choice or they wouldn't. What mattered was he was finally being true to himself. As he walked, the memories of his time in the military began to surface, the faces of those he had served with, the battles he had fought, lives he had taken. They were ghosts, all of them, lingering in the corners of his mind. But now they felt less like a burden and more like a reminder of what he had survived, of what he had chosen to leave behind. He recalled the young man in the stronghold, the one that he had spared. Daniel often wondered what had become of him. Did he go home to his family? Did he return to his own battles to fight another day? Or had he found his own path out of the madness, just as Daniel had? The truth was, Daniel would probably never know, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that in that moment, Daniel had chosen life over death, mercy over violence, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a piece of his own humanity. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Daniel's thoughts turned to the future. He had skills, training that could serve him well in the civilian world. But more than that, he had a determination to make something of his second chance he had given himself. He didn't want to be defined by his past, by the things he had done in the name of duty. He wanted to be something more, something better. The road eventually led him to a small town, a quiet place far removed from the war that had consumed so much of his life. It was the kind of town where people still waved at strangers, where the air smelled of fresh bread and blooming flowers, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional bark of a dog. It was peaceful, and Daniel found himself drawn to it, as though the town itself was offering him a sanctuary, a place to start anew. He found a small cafe on the edge of town, its windows filled with the golden light of the afternoon sun. Daniel stepped inside, the warm, inviting aroma of coffee and baked goods wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. He ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, watching the world go by as he sipped from his cup. For the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel allowed himself to simply be, to simply exist in the moment, without the weight of the past or the uncertainty of the future pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what he would do next, but he knew whatever it was, it would be on his terms, in line with the man he had become. As he sat there, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. The world was still full of conflict, of challenges and hardships, but Daniel had made his choice. He had chosen peace, both within himself and in his actions, and that, he realized, was more than enough. The road ahead was long and the journey far from over, but Daniel was ready for it. He would face whatever came his way with the same resolve that led him to walk away from the life of a soldier, because now he was something more. He was a peaceful warrior, and his battle was no longer with others, but with himself, to be the best man he could be. And that, he knew, was a fight worth winning.